interesting, and glad to know that the European data protection has reached far corners of the world.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, but don't go away. Yeah. I'll refresh again.
Han kommer hoppet af. Nu kommer han.
So go ahead, Prashant.
Can you hear me, Kirsty?
Så du skal ikke trykke på speak, så skal du bare...
Can we go to the next slide, please?
Go ahead, Prashant. Han bliver ved med at forsvinde.
Hi everyone, this is Prashant Gupta, partner with EY. I will be briefly talking about the draft data protection bill of India, and also what kind of synergies it has an impact with EU other regulations like GDPR. Can we move to the next slide, please? If you see, this basically talks about that how data protection bill is structured, and it's primarily talks about how it is gonna be impacting the overall, you can say, impact across PII information and within the establishment in India, as well as you can say the services and the goods offering within the ecosystem, and also behavior monitoring across the cross-border data. So these are some of the, I would say, areas which are covered in this, and it applies to any Indian company, Indian citizen or person or body of person which are involved in processing of personal data. Can we move to the next slide, please? This is very crowded slide. I will probably take a step back and just set the context. It talks about in terms of applicability, which is any Indian company, Indian citizen, government agencies, or anybody who is processing the PII information within the Indian jurisdiction. They also talk about different types of data consideration in the bill, which can be personal data, which is for a natural person. Then it talks about sensitive personal data, which is basically to do with the age identifier, life, status, caste, tribe, everything. And then it talks about critical personal data, which is time to time government has powers to define. Penalties, I will say, is pretty much similar to GDPR, where it talks about 2 to 4% of the global turnover, and there are some imprisonment fines also up to 3 years. But this is again a draft bill. Still, it is not finalized. So as we go forward, we will see it may take few more months to final this draft bill, and when it becomes a regulation. The key highlight of the bill, it covers notices, consents, then also privacy by design, data principal rights, data fiduciary, and also there is a mechanism of grievances, how you can address the grievances process. And there has been sections which talk about data protection impact assessment, as well as it talks about how the regulation with regards to managing the data protection compliances, non-compliances, and setup of data protection authority for the same. It also requires appointment of data protection officer, and in general, the impact is basically that how you can say India being hub for a lot of back offices. A lot of global companies have their setup here for analytics as well as for their back offices. How that can be also looked into from privacy perspective, if there are any kind of you can say exemptions or certain areas which to be covered with this regulation. Can we move on to next slide, please? It's basically the key requirement around this is categorizing all personal data as you do it under GDPR or any other global, you can say, privacy regulation, data protection privacy regulation. It talks about data fiduciary. They have to maintain and follow the principles of record keeping, data audits, data protection, impact assessment, as well as privacy by design. It also brings an impact around data auditors. So that's a provision which government has given who will be nominated as independent auditor to perform the audits. Then there are ways they can allow and subject to certain restrictions where the data which is categorized as sensitive data is moving out of India or any kind of a cross-border transactions. Then apart from that, they also have a provision of data fiduciary and data processor, which basically similar to GDPR. Then in terms of the overall life cycle of data also starts from creation up to the discovery and then archival of data, which is all discussed in this particular draft. And from the perspective what we have seen, there are 3 or 4 stages which can help implement this. Is one is to gain an understanding and draw out your gap assessment with your organization, building the roadmap, and then going with a long-term implementation plan around that. Can we move to the next slide, please? This slide gives more clarity around the scope definitions and formality, where we see in the broader definition of personal data, extended territorial effect, harmonized Indian data protection regime, data protection officer, and then international data transfer. As I said, that can be based case-to-case basis how you define your data. Then also new principles, appropriate safeguards, which are data minimization, accountability, impact assessment, and privacy by design. There are certain areas which are more towards the principal rights, and the legal ground for data processing is there should be a reasonable purpose, high bar for consent, right to be forgotten, and data protection. Right to be forgotten is still something which is under debate, which is happening, and it may, as I said, in the final regulation, these things will get clarified. However, a lot of companies have started working towards it, how they can actually build a roadmap, because it is something which they have to start from and bringing to the maturity. So that may take some time for them. And enforcement sanctions also is right to correction, clear and plain language, penalties for companies, security data breach notification, and as well as the liability around that. Can you please to next slide, please? What can be the key considerations for this particular bill is regarding embracing the privacy by design, manage data breaches, revisit consents, manage user right, conduct data privacy impact assessment, third parties ecosystem, limit the storage of data, regulatory landscape, employees awareness, as well as incorporate data handling practices, enhance accountability, and reinforce personal data security measure. So I will just spend maybe a couple more minutes here in terms of if you see what is happening in India. It has been a subject which has taken a lot of front seat, a lot of attention, and you can say in last probably couple of years. But the initiative has started almost a decade with an Indian IT Act, where was a limited provision of privacy which has been spoken. And there's a lot of discussion between India and EU, even some of them I'm myself involved, where we are talking about what can be the bridge framework which will be used to compliance, and how considering that today a lot of companies have set up in India, whether it's from Europe or different parts of the geographies, how that can be bring out more synergies and efficiencies rather than creating a redundancy. The companies have to do the work in their home country as well as in the countries where they have their setup. For example, like say Denmark and India or Netherlands or India. So there is a lot of discussion around that, and I think government is pretty considering certain areas where they want to provide impact from business perspective, how these areas will impact business and what can be do's and don'ts. But as we move forward, once this particular committee finalizes the bill and it becomes a regulation, we will get more clarity around that. However, we see still 80-85% of the things which we are talking is going to stick around as they are the key leading practices and which is benchmark against the global practices too. Can we move forward, please? In summary, if you see, it talks about on the left side is scope and application, lawfulness of processing, protection for children, individual rights, accountability requirements, security, breach notification, international data transfer, enforcement, miscellaneous provisions. And the greens here, basically, they talk about what are the denotes. There are little no differences between India Data Protection Bill versus GDPR. And if you see like yellows where there are minor significant differences and reds where there are major differences between the two, and that's where the cross-border comes into play. And so you see some of the areas like miscellaneous provisions as well as accountability requirements as well as lawfulness of processing. That's where some of the differences have been, and I think we should once we have the bill regulation out, probably it will be better to discuss more in detail. Can we move to the next slide, please? This again gives some more clarity in terms of penalty. If you see, there is a similarity between Indian Data Protection Bill versus GDPR in terms of consent, which is needed from the data subject. So it's pretty much same. Right of data subjects and principals are also talked about in both the regulation. Privacy by design, DPIA, and other security requirements are also mentioned in both Data Protection Bill of India as well as EU GDPR. Data protection officer requirement as well as governance, data minimization, lawful processing, as well as records of processing purpose and transparency have been covered. If you want to see some of the differences, as I said, right to be forgotten, it basically does not allow Indian companies to ask completely delete the data and acceptable that they have shared an acceptable practice in EU. So that's something which is under discussion. Cross-border data transfer is also something where they talk about a data copy to reside in India, which can be something maybe not commercially viable for every company. So that's where some of the differences. Then the criminal liability, which is probably is different than the way you comply with GDPR. Some terminology is different between data fiduciary, data subject, and then data breach notification, where the notification to DPR made only if the breach likely to cause harm and it is left to data processor and data controller. So that's where some of these key indicative differences I can say and commonalities. Can we move to the next slide, please? So that's what I have covered. If anybody has any questions or concerns, and I know it's still a couple of minutes left, we can pick it up. Otherwise, I would say that this definitely going to bring a lot of difference the way the data processing happens in Indian geography, as well as how the data centers are operating with the global service providers, all these particular areas, along with cross-border trade between different countries. What kind of implications on the business as well as on the commercial aspect will be there because of these nuances. But I think in the parallel, the discussion between the governments as well as the framework which global companies are trying to follow, there will be a lot of synergies between the global data protection privacy as well as India regulation. Thank you very much for your time and listening to this. If you have any questions and comments, feel free to reach out. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you.